Okay, we're live. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us once again for the 16th episode of our Injustice at Home webinar series. My name is Ashley Young, and I am the Prisoner and Family Coordinator for the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Our mission is to defend civil liberties and freedoms, promote a fair U.S. criminal justice system, and advocate for the rights of political prisoners targeted in the War on Terror. You can find all of our previous webinars in the video section of our Facebook page or on our Civil Freedoms YouTube channel where you can subscribe. Topics range from COVID-19 crisis in federal prisons, the unjust case of Dr. Afia Siddiqui, to updates on our ongoing coronavirus prisoner release project. Next week, we'll be joined by two impacted family members who are both wellness and mental health professionals, Sonali Siddiqui and Zaira Abubakar, for an important discussion on how to transform personal and collective trauma into resilience in the context of the War on Terror and the criminalization of Muslim communities. Now, today we will be examining the government's response to mass protests against police brutality, where, according to The Intercept, more than 200 activists across several states are being charged with various felonies, including terrorism, since the summer uprising that followed the police killing of George Floyd. Earlier this week, Attorney General Bill Barr reportedly told prosecutors to bring the rarely used sedition charge against protesters, effectively accusing dissenters exercising their First Amendment rights of violently seeking to overthrow the government. Other conservative outlets, such as Voice of America and Fox News, have reported that the FBI has opened hundreds of terrorism investigations against protesters. And truly, in one of the most bizarre and twisted cases of FBI entrapment, filed under the category of "you can't make this up," two gun-toting anti-police activists linked to the far-right Boogaloo movement have been charged with material support to Hamas after they were flagged and later infiltrated at street protests in Minneapolis. While CCF reserves judgment until further studying this case, it seems to have all the elements of preemptive prosecution, from the gullible targets to the introduction of the FBI undercover agent and informant, which hatched the entire plot all the way through to the arrest. In an interview with the Intercept, a Hamas spokesperson denounced the FBI sting and stated that their struggle is confined by the boundaries of Palestine and have nothing planned against the United States. With many policing tactics coming under scrutiny by racial justice activists, the questionable practice of infiltration and spying, particularly on political activists and Muslims, is once again being examined in light of these recent reports. In this webinar, we will examine the long-standing practice by police, from the FBI to the NYPD, to go undercover and infiltrate, intimidate, incite, and criminalize progressive activists, protest movements, and following 9/11 Muslim communities in an effort to quash dissent. Be sure to stick around until the end to learn how to resist these efforts and protect yourself. Very important. Now, facilitating the discussion and sharing his analysis on these issues is Fahad Ahmed, the Executive Director of Grassroots and Community-Run Organization DRUM, Desi's Rising Up and Moving. And CCF, he's also a CCF board member. He is based in New York City and has been working on the issues of racial profiling, immigrant justice, police accountability, and national security for over the last 20 years. Joining him is another New Yorker, a fellow Muslim organizer, advocate, and public policy professional, Aisha Irfan. Aisha has spent the last 9 years building and leading successful legislative advocacy campaigns, one of which was aimed at protecting First Amendment freedom of speech, increasing youth civic engagement, creating culturally responsive classrooms, and disbanding the school to prison pipeline. As a student at Brooklyn College, she and her Muslim friends were targeted by undercover NYPD officer who posed as their friend as part of a widely criticized NYPD Muslim surveillance program. And finally, I'm honored to introduce Chip Gibbons, the policy director at Defending Rights and Dissent, and the author of the report, Still Spying on Dissent, the Enduring Problem of the FBI First Amendment Abuse. He hosts the Still Spying podcast, and as a journalist and researcher focusing on the abuses of the US national security state at home and abroad, his writings have been featured in The Intercept, The Nation, and in These Times. Thank you so much to the three of you. Now, Fahad, I'm glad to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon to everyone. Honored to be able to moderate and participate in this discussion with two great other participants. Initiative of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms for hosting this conversation, along with many of the other conversations before. As Ashley just mentioned, we're seeing cases of the use of surveillance and infiltration manifesting in response to the uprisings and the political upheavals that are underway right now. And to be able to understand the sort of what's happening now, it is always helpful to understand what has happened before us and what are the different ways and the different manifestations that it continues to happen in these sorts of things. So the agenda and the flow for today will be, we will ask Chip to share some history of surveillance historically in this country, particularly as it relates to political repression and undermining dissent. I will share a little bit about what happened in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Aisha will share a story about a direct experience of encountering the surveillance state. Chip will round out with sort of like what are some of the current manifestations that are coming up above. And then we'll have a discussion, a little bit more of a free-flowing discussion, talking about the political purposes of surveillance, how do we counter and how do we resist, and then what are the opportunities for us moving forward. We'll take some questions and then we will close out. So please do stay on for the whole conversation. I will first pass it to Chip to share the history of surveillance before 9/11, particularly as it relates to political repression and the stifling of dissent.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be invited to this presentation. I'm going to be talking very briefly about the history of political surveillance in the United States. If you're wondering what this is behind me, this is a timeline from the Still Spying report of FBI First Amendment abuses. The timeline starts in 1908 when the Bureau of Investigation is formed, but I want to go back a little bit before that, just very briefly to say that in 1886, there was something called the Haymarket Massacre. I'm not going to go into details because it's in the weeds, but after it, these anarchists who'd been on strike were rounded up, and the Chicago Police Department started what was believed to be the first Red Squad. Red, you know, as in communism or socialism or anarchism. And what it was a police intelligence unit devoted to surveilling quote unquote Reds, labor activists, socialists, etc. And it wasn't just in Chicago. In the early 20th century, a number of other cities, New York, LA, many others adopted Red Squads as well, which were police intelligence units which tracked down radicals. As I said, in 1908, the FBI's precursor, the Bureau of Investigation, is formed. Theodore Roosevelt asked Congress to create it. Congress says no. Congress goes on recess, and his Attorney General makes the Bureau of Investigation. As a result of this, to this day, the FBI has no statutory charter from Congress limiting what it can do, what its powers are. And this is very disturbing, and I'm going to talk about this in the second segment a little bit more. A while into the Bureau of Investigation's formation, I believe 1919, its intelligence division is formed. The intelligence division is initially called the Radical Division. Its name is later changed to the General Intelligence Division. So once again, we have this idea that law enforcement should be using its intelligence powers to spy on dissent. And there's sort of a broad ruling class consensus around this. So that's why I always like to mention the Red Squads first, because what the FBI is doing here is basically forming a Red Squad in the federal police. And this unit is headed up by a young man named Edgar Hoover, who had previously worked in the Library of Congress, and he develops a system for tracking radicals. People debate whether or not it's based off of the card catalog or not. I like to think of J. Edgar Hoover as the man who used library science for evil, but he basically indexes, the way a card catalog would, various radicals across the country. And during the Palmer raids, the FBI goes around the country and rounds up people, arrests them without warrants, holds them without proper charges, deports people. And to this day, the FBI considers, the Palmer raids to be an abuse of power. But that's how Hoover gets his start. Hoover then goes on to become the head of the FBI. And as head of the FBI, he transforms it into not just being a domestic police force, but a domestic intelligence agency as well. And he brings with him that same sort of pattern and practices of indexing and spying on radicals. And when I say index, they were literally on index cards with the person's name, with the person's political affiliations. And if you go through old FBI files, you'll see Hoover send a memo like, send me a 5x7 index card, literally index cards. These index cards are on the pretext that these people are to be rounded up and detained without trial in the event of a mass emergency. In 1955, the height of this program, there's 26,000 Americans on index cards. There's a second grouping of index cards called the reserve list, which is people not dangerous enough for the first one, but still need to be spied on. And in addition to the security index, the FBI comes up with something called COINTELPRO, or Counterintelligence Program, in 1956. And it's important to realize that COINTELPRO was not a surveillance program. The Church Committee is very clear that it was a domestic covert operation. And the reason why COINTELPRO was created was because the FBI was concerned that the Supreme Court was becoming too liberal and they could no longer bring criminal charges against members of the Communist Party. So it's literally a program of domestic covert action designed to target groups that they can bring no criminal charges against in order to disrupt and neutralize First Amendment protected speech. And that's a really shocking thing. And I think it's worth thinking about it, because sometimes we on the left treat COINTELPRO as just, oh, the FBI spying on people, but it was far more insidious and dangerous than that. In the 1970s, there's a lot of pushback on the FBI because of Watergate, because of the failures of the war in Vietnam, and they get some reforms put on them. But shortly after that, they start this massive investigation into opponents of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, mainly the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. They use their foreign counterintelligence powers to carry out this investigation. They try to say that because these people oppose, Reagan arming death squads in El Salvador, they must be materially supporting foreign terrorists. It's a line you probably will hear again since then. And then in 1991, in the lead up to the Persian Gulf War, the FBI goes to the homes of Arab Americans and asks them questions about the war, asks them questions about their views on Palestine. And there's a lot of really sort of puzzling questions at the time, namely, how does the FBI have a list of Americans who are of Arab national origin and knows where they live, so they can show up and say, hey, what do you think of Saddam Hussein? What do you think of Yasser Arafat? And that's a really dark question that we still don't know the answer to. Throughout the 90s, the FBI is engaged in broad surveillance of the Arab American and Muslim community in this country, particularly in something called Operation Vulgar Betrayal. They also go really hard after animal rights and environmental activists, saying they're the #1 domestic terrorist threat, even though they've never killed anyone, and this is the time period during which, you know, the Oklahoma City bombing happens. So that's the situation pre 9/11, and I'm going to let my co-panelist tell us about what happens after 9/11.
Thank you so much, Chip. I think one of the things I want to offer before I start is we should see like sort of two parts of surveillance. One, which is I think like the main focus of this conversation, is the surveillance for the purposes of repressing political activity, political movements, and efforts of dissent. And then alongside that, there's also surveillance which serves a political purpose. And so if we think about the second, half, surveillance for the purpose of political ends, you know, then the history of it goes much further, and we start to see surveillance in the times of slavery as ways of social control of enslaved peoples, and ways to like divide up communities. Before 9/11, my cousin was targeted as part of the war on drugs, where they also use informants who would go in and build relationships with small-time shop owners, convenience store workers, and entrap them into drug cases. And so, you know, like there's this, and this trend, I think, in particular plays out for Muslim communities. So I wanted to provide this context. And so it is very much like this experience of like my cousin being targeted, which played a strong role in me coming into political activism. I became active with Drum in 2000. We were doing work before 9/11, a lot with immigrant detainees. And so when 9/11 happened, and there was massive numbers of people being disappeared from our communities across New York City, we were the first folks to locate them and started to visit them inside of detention centers. And these folks, as they were being detained, there was just being heavy amounts of interrogation to try to draw intel or information out of them. But most of these were just working class folks who really had nothing to give. And, you know, then there was like, I think in these sweeps in the New York area, there was about 1,200, mostly men, maybe a couple of women that were picked up. And all of it produced zero results in terms of actual convictions related to terrorism or any intelligence. A year later, the Special Registrations Program starts, which tries to register men from Muslim majority countries who are not citizens. They register 83,000 people. They put 13,000 into deportations. And out of that, the result is zero people with ties to terrorism, zero people with actual intelligence. And so at this point, like, you know, we start to see that there's a rising criticism of the operations. And maybe about 6 months after 9/11, I think about April of 2001, of 2002, is we start to see a shift in law enforcement, that they started coming to the communities and talking to community leaders and saying, essentially, we're sorry we picked up all these people. Why don't you work with us to identify the right people? So for those of us, you know, us in Drum, we were trained by a lot of people that survived COINTELPRO. We immediately knew what that was. I think from the immigrant Muslim communities, we were probably like the only force. And then there was African-American Muslim communities that also knew this history and warned. But people were in such a state of fear that they felt like, I don't want to say no to law enforcement. I just want to say yes. I just want to make problems go away. And as soon as they were let in, it started with like community forums. Immediately, we started seeing people coming to us and being like, hey, I went to that forum. I got the business card of the FBI officer. And then, you know, he asked me to come to his office, and then he asked me all these questions, and he asked me to work with him. And, you know, once the community institutions opened their doors, they essentially provided a stamp of legitimacy to the law enforcement agencies to say like, hey, look, we're opening our door to them, which means that we're trusting them. And so community members relied on the trust of community institutions and community leaders. And that's where we really see the surveillance apparatus of the FBI and of the NYPD and other law enforcement agencies just grow drastically. Because frankly, they didn't have that many officers from within our communities that they could use them. And, like there clearly was suspicion if, like some white officer comes in that clearly knows nothing and is asking political questions. But what they were able to do is recruit people from within our communities to then target our communities. Oftentimes with, these would be people that would have like some of their own charges or immigration cases. And so they would be blackmailed. I can make this charge go away if you work for us. In some cases, it would be people that are being offered money. One of the most prominent cases that I've worked with is Shahwar Mateen Siraj. It was a Pakistani young man targeted by the NYPD. The informant is paid $100,000 for a year and a half of building a relationship, inciting, and then entrapping. The young person has an IQ of 79. You can put those two things together and kind of figure out what happens. Mateen is now serving a 30-year sentence. And his mother's been one of the most foremost leaders in the fight against surveillance and the targeting of Muslim communities. And so these are ways in which they're able to bring people in, entice them to work for them. And we've seen this apparatus grow. And I think the last thing I want to end with is that there are levels to the apparatus. The highest level is, actually I'll start with the lowest level, is when there's this surveillance happening and our communities do not know about it. So they're spying on the mosque, they're spying on the community center, they're spying on a political organization. Then there's a medium level where they're sending in informants, they're sending in undercovers, they're trying to recruit people into something. The first one, communities don't notice. The second one, people who encounter it do notice. And that's probably where it becomes the most tangible as how dangerous all of this is. But it's only when you understand the first two levels that you're able to understand the third level, which is when those informants and undercovers, for all these various reasons, produce results, which is they entrap somebody successfully. So somebody gets arrested, probably there's a 95% conviction or guilty plea rate, maybe 98%. And so when those cases are brought out, that becomes the way to fearmonger. That fear-mongering allows the law enforcement agencies to increase their budgets and continue to justify these operations. But the thing is, we only publicly hear about this last one, and it scares us as people, as human beings, and as communities. And nobody wants to touch that. I don't want to get involved in whether this person is an actual terrorist or not, or was it somebody that's entrapped? And the easiest thing for me to do is just stay away. And it is in this, for this reason, that actually that second level ends up being the most useful and instructive for us in being able to understand how surveillance, infiltration, and disruption operates. And for that reason, I'm very happy that we're able to have Aisha join with us, who can talk about the incident and the intersections of actual political activity and religious community and political implications of that show out in that case. Aisha.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me. Thank you for having this conversation. Thank you to everyone joining. Super honored to be here and to share more about surveillance experiences of New Yorkers directly on the ground in the aftermath of 9/11 and in the years since. So by way of background, I'm in my early 30s. I was 14 when 9/11 happened. I was in 8th grade. Grew up in Little Pakistan, Brooklyn. So a heavy working class immigrant enclave in Brooklyn, New York. And stayed local for school, middle school, high school, heard of special registration as it was coming out, which was, folks from a series of countries were asked to go and register with the government. And so I think the community I grew up in, I think overnight, over the course of months, I saw it drastically change. Folks left out of their own free will, anticipating potential deportation or a huge backlash. A lot of folks were taken up, a lot of folks were deported. And so just the community I grew up in, within the course of a few years, storefronts became really empty. School demographics shifted drastically. My family, we were lucky in that we did have legal status and citizenship. And so we're able to protect ourselves from some pieces of it. But I think this culture of fear and distrust absolutely was completely pervasive within the local community. So stayed local for college, went to CUNY Brooklyn College, which is part of the public university system in New York, located right about a mile away from Little Blackstone. And so largely serves, the CUNY system, for those who are unfamiliar, is the largest public education university system in the country, serves about 275,000 students, mostly from working class backgrounds, largely Asian, Asian American, South Asian, Latino, Black. So really like New York City, serving the New York City public schools. Decided to stay local. So I started college in 2006, but a few months before I started college, an alumni from my school, Fahad Hashmi, was entrapped, exactly to Fahad's point. Created and captured is a term that we've like really used. How do you really monitor students on campus for any sort of political activity? Whose radars go off to continue to monitor the student? And so very soon after graduation from college, he was, I think, 22, 23, Fahad Hashmi moved to London. In June 2006, he ended up being entrapped and charged with material support to terrorism charges and extradited back to the US. And so this was really my start to my entire college experience. I started school in September. And within a month or two, older students who were part of the Brooklyn College Islamic Society pulled aside students who were incoming and new on campus. And it became really, there were folks on campus who were watching what students were doing, who were watching what students were saying, and potentially reporting those findings back. And so we had really strict rules within the Islamic Society about not talking about anything political, not leaving political literature in our student association room. And if you think about what a college experience is supposed to entail for young folks, it really is a lot of political exploration. It's the exploration of ourselves and our identities and really growing into who we are. And that's what we want for young people, to ask those questions, to seek out those answers. But in this case, like as soon as we started, for our group of folks, so young Muslim Americans on campus, we knew that wasn't safe for us. We knew that there potentially were folks watching. And I think there's some degree of just dark humor that you use if you're with a group of friends and you're like, oh, which one of us is the informant? Who don't we know? But again, like if we're talking about this evolution of sense of self, like it's not something any 18, 19, 20-year-old should be asking. Which one of us is not a real friend who's like reporting our activities back to law enforcement? And so while we were on campus, though, I think like there was this natural tension of maybe I'm being watched, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm crazy. But at the same time, there's this active case with this alumni on campus, former alumni from the school who has an active case. And so what is our role in really organizing and mobilizing and building with the communities that he really was a part of? So through my student organizing, I actually got connected to one of his former professors, Professor Jean Theo Harris, who really, I think, adopted this role of facilitator between the academic community and in her core as an organizer. And so really became a mentor and a guide, and was able to speak to the experiences of Fahad that she had seen in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, right? So 9/11 happened in 2001. I started school in 2006. Fahad was arrested in 2006. She had a degree of the institutional knowledge, and she knew exactly what was going on. And so there was just a degree of comfort there. And so over the course of the 4 years that I was on campus, we mobilized for hearings, we organized vigils. Fahad was held in solitary pre-trial, which in the civil liberties community, as you all know, folks organized against and really called attention to how awful those circumstances were. And as Fahad mentioned, because of the 99% conviction rate, and because we are so scared of what does terrorism mean, what does radicalization mean, what does it mean that someone's a threat, folks end up taking the plea deals. And so in April of 2010, Fahad ended up taking a 15-year deal. He was held in solitary for 3 years post, the plea deal as well. But if you look at it, he was arrested in 2006. He took the plea deal in 2010. That's the entirety of my college career, was revolving around this specific case, around issues, civil liberties issues. And for me, it became really hard to separate out like being a directly impacted community member with the need and desire to organize and mobilize. And I think, it's only as an adult now that I've had the experience of actually taking a step back and being like, how did those early years really, what did they lead to? How did they impact how I show up in the world? So I graduated in 2010, continued to organize and work with local organizations on legislative actions. In New York, we had a mayoral election in 2013. And so really one of the things the Muslim community was pushing for was an end to this vast warrantless surveillance program. 2011, the Associated Press finally blew the lid off of this huge program, really exposed, I think, everything that folks on the ground knew was happening, but we finally had some legitimacy in the form of this huge investigation that ultimately ended up winning Pulitzer Prizes. But what they found was the NYPD's surveillance apparatus spanned multiple states. They had informants on payroll. It spanned, colleges and major universities across the East Coast, from Princeton to Columbia to the CUNY system. And what we realized very quickly, NYU was included, was that the wealthier universities, the private universities that have access, that have very strong advocates within their administration, those administrators right off the bat were very vocal in at least pushing back to the city and the NYPD, not on our watch, not with our students. The administration held town halls, student leaders held town halls. And within the CUNY system, we were hoping for the exact same response. And at Brooklyn College, we were told by the president at the time that if you guys are really impacted, maybe you should pursue litigation. And so for us, again, like we're talking about a public university system that primarily serves students, low-income students and families. And we're being told by those in power that they will not have our back, that informants can show up on campus, can entrap and surveil students, can make us question our own selves and our own identities and our own understanding of our faith and criminalize it. And at the end of the day, we will be, not safe from the police itself. We will not be safe from our campus administration. So this was ongoing when the 2011 Associated Press reports came out. Continued organizing, I think there were a handful of us who had lived through the Fahad Hashmi case, who were organizing on the ground then, who were really hoping to create some degree of change, and got involved in the advocacy work, got involved in the organizing work, and continued to really put ourselves out there. In 2015, so a few years after I've graduated college, I've been really involved in hyperlocal organizations on the ground. We hear of the arrest of 2 women from the extended CUNY, the City University of New York community. And their names are Asia and Noel, and exact same headlines, right? These 2 women are being accused by the Department of Justice and the NYPD of potentially trying to make bombs. And I remember just reading that story, and it's all over our news feeds. We'd all attended the same events. There's a very strong, I think, like Muslim American culture within New York in the organizing space, in the activism space, with folks who are exploring identity and faith and religion. And so these are 2 women who we know, who we've all been around, and their names and their pictures are plastered under, yes, they're arrested on a terrorism charge. Now, given that we have this organizing history, right off the bat, our mind goes to there's an informant involved. And this time, for the first time that we know of, it's a woman informant, right? In a lot of these cases, it's been Muslim men who have been targeted, but these are 2 women, and therefore definitely a woman informant involved. Went back to my professor, who had been such a strong ally in the years that I'd been her student. And it turns out one of the women was being represented by the same person who represented Fahad Hashmi all those years ago. So she came and she gave me a description, and she was like, hey, I have a description for who this female informant is. And it's a woman who goes by Mel. She's Turkish. Does this ring a bell at all? And to me, it didn't. I was just like scouring through my memory. I'm like, maybe, but I'm not entirely sure. And so for the rest of that day, I end up just texting a handful of very close friends. And I was like, hey, like and I didn't tell them why I was asking. I was like, hey, does the name Mel sound familiar? Does this woman sound familiar? She's apparently been around. And I think within 2 hours, a friend responds right away. She's like, yes, why are you asking? And so I call her and, I was like, this is the description we got for the informant. And right away, she was like, I know exactly who this is. I suspected this for years. It turns out Mel had shown up at CUNY Brooklyn College in 2011. So as, they were being exposed for their activities, a few months prior, she had shown up, posing as a student, posing as a convert, and started befriending women over the course of multiple years. And so within, I think, a few hours, we get back on the phone with a group of girlfriends, and we're like, let's map out everything we know about who this woman is and where she's been and who she's had interactions with. And I think within 2 hours, we had like a 4-year timeline of she showed up in April 2011. The last time anyone saw her was a few months prior to Noel, March 15. And so we went back to, our journalist friends. We went back to lawyers. We were like, we have pictures of this woman. What's going to happen if we out her publicly? Are we potentially putting ourselves in danger of a lawsuit or anything else? Is there going to be a further target on our back? And we got advice to go ahead and out her. And, continue to, I think one of the things about this entire case that has caught me off guard is I met my professor in 2006. These arrests happened in 2015. It took 9 years worth of relationships and trust for us to actually have all of the necessary pieces to be able to go back to the NYPD and say, you are claiming A happened or B happened, and you're claiming that this is not warrantless surveillance where you're just trying to cast a really wide net and in some way you're criminalizing religious practice. We actually had the proof and we had our receipts to say, this has been our experience. This is a group of 5 or 6 of us. This is what we put together. And, those cases, again, same headlines, the flashy headlines of catching a terrorist. And every time you just dig a little bit below the surface, you find out the folks being targeted, there's a degree of marginalization. There are, mental health issues or their financial issues that these informants come in and prey on. And the Aisha and Noel ultimately also took plea deals and received 15-year sentences. But as the hearings were happening, because we had outed Mel as the informant, because her picture was kind of all over social media and in the public domain, she potentially would have been asked to come testify. And the judge ruled that in order to protect Mel's identity and safety, she would be allowed to show up in a full abaya and a niqab. So actually covering her face. So the exact same religious practices that young Muslim Americans were being targeted for, suddenly it's okay to wear that as a costume and parade around in a courtroom where you yourself have targeted and trapped innocent people. And so I think just it's easy to think if you are doing nothing wrong, there is nothing to be afraid of, even if there happens to be law enforcement amongst you. And what we often forget is that's not where it ends. The ultimate purpose is to create and capture, to create a narrative, to create a degree of fear, and to create, would-be terrorists and capture them so you have the flashy headlines so that you can continue to operate with impunity and without any accountability. And I'll end with that.
Thank you so much, Aisha. And thank you for sharing the story. I think there's like countless numbers of examples of these types of stories that exist within Muslim communities, within activist communities. I want to share just like a couple of brief ones to just like sort of like further deepen the point. when Aisha talked about like the Associated Press leaks into 2011, citywide, there was lots of demonstrations and rallies and marches that happened as a result of it. On one of the rallies, I think it was in like April of 2012, we had the community member who came and joined our contingent, really energetic, really angry, really loud. It's very unusual for just community members that are not affiliated, that haven't been brought by an organization to show up for an issue like this. We exchanged phone numbers, met up with him later in the neighborhood, and then just asking him basic questions, got a sense that like he was hiding something, pressed him, and like I think he got nervous, and then he was essentially like, I work for the NYPD. The NYPD sent an informant to the rally against informants. That's just the logic of that. You surveil the protests against surveillance. I think there's like more than one case of like the leadership of a mosque throwing somebody out for engaging in inflammatory rhetoric or like trying to encourage people to engage in criminal activities, only later to discover that that person is an undercover or an informant. And so there's tons of these cases that exist within Muslim communities. And then also like within our communities around political activity. So when these leaks came out, one of the first documents that came out was a document from like 2004 or 2005. And in this one document, like it was like 1 week's report. And they had like, sort of like, here's what the anti-war protesters are doing. There was another section, here's kind of what the anti-police brutality activists are doing, which is where like our name as an organization of Drum was listed for being involved in organizing against the NYPD's killing of Sean Bell. And then the next section was Muslim students at, I believe it was City College of New York, who were going on a rafting trip. And so it was, like sort of who's going on the rafting trip and kind of like what are the things that they're doing and talking about. And so this is how the surveillance apparatus, like it sees all of these things as threats, being anti-war, fighting for civil liberties, fighting against the surveillance state, fighting against police murder, religious and social activity. So like the range of it is pretty broad, and just given the tools that they had, as Aisha mentioned, they can do a lot, even if you have nothing to hide. I want to pass it to Chip briefly, just to be able to talk about what are some of the current manifestations we're seeing before we get into a deeper discussion.
Sure. So I think the big things for people who are involved in racial justice protest right now to be aware of is just how loose the FBI's guidelines right now are. Other than things like wiretaps, home searches, national security letters, and pen registers, which invoke either the Fourth Amendment or a statute, the FBI's surveillance and investigatory powers are defined by the Attorney General. And in the current Attorney General guidelines, the FBI can open a type of investigation called an assessment. And an assessment requires an authorized purpose, but not any factual predication to believe the suspect or the subject of the assessment has broken a law or threatens national security. This is the first time since the Church Committee the FBI is allowed to investigate people without factual predication. And in spite of this low threshold for opening an assessment, the FBI is allowed to deploy intrusive investigative means, including physical surveillance, going through garbage, and tasking confidential informants. And the other thing that I want to point out is a few years ago, it came out that the FBI had something called a Black Identity Extremism Threat Assessment, which argued that perceived racism is their words, of course there's actually racism, outrage at perceived racism, police violence, could lead to people carrying out lethal retaliatory violence against police. So what that is saying is that speech and activism against racism, against police brutality, that is a precursor to violent action against police, which is basically opening the door for Black Lives Matter and other movements to be surveilled. And we later saw in a leak of documents to the Young Turks that one of the things they recommended doing to mitigate the threat of Black identity extremists we're opening up quote unquote type 3 assessments. And these are assessments where you don't have a target, you're preactively looking for the threat. And The Intercept obtained a bunch of Black identity extremism assessments from FBI departments across the country, where they're not targeting specific individuals. They're going out and trying to find, who are the Black identity extremists in the area. And you have to remember, the first part of being a Black identity extremist is outrage at racial injustice, outrage at police brutality. So given how low the bar is to open, given what's considered suspect, that's clearly an open door to surveilling racial justice protesters. Trump and Barr and people like that have obviously all been really inflammatory in the language, excuse me, in the language they've used about these protests. And Barr has actually started a task force on violent extremism, violent anti-government extremism in response to the protest. And one of the things it's going to do is be preventative about, quote unquote, violent anti-government extremists. And whenever you're talking about prevention, you're opening the door to going after people's political views, because if you're preventing, extremist violence, and the first part of extremist violence per the FBI is having, extremist views, well, how are you going to prevent that? Who are you going to seek out as the subject? That's going to be people engaged in First Amendment protected speech. And the final thing I'll just point out is, this was mentioned in the beginning, but I want to mention it again, is the head of this task force was called to testify before Congress, and she said that since George Floyd was murdered by police, that the FBI has opened over 300 domestic terrorism investigations. And we know they're coming for the George Floyd protesters. So those are things you should be aware of at the current moment.
Thank you so much, Chuck. So for the next period, I want to do a little bit of a more freer flowing discussion. The first question, and I'll start with Aisha, is, and you can speak on both kind of how it had impacted in your case or the people around you, but you could also talk broadly. What is the political purpose of the surveillance, and kind of what impacts are intended to be achieved through the surveillance?
Yeah, thank you for your question. One of the things that I didn't mention is when the Aisha Noel case was going on, and we came up with this timeline of her activity, we started working with a journalist to tell this story. And she was able to get in touch with the NYPD and talk about what the precipice was for them even showing up at Brooklyn College. And what we ultimately narrowed it down to, so again, like Mel showed up in 2011, but what we narrowed it down to was the NYPD had her show up. The initial target for an investigation was a woman who'd been involved in the organizing in support of Fahad Hashmi. She had made an illustration that was used widely on movement flyers for his case. And so that was the very initial, a target was chosen at Brooklyn College. And so when you ask this question, right, this was a young woman who was engaged in First Amendment protected freedom of speech. She was vocal and organizing on campus with her fellow students against an issue that had garnered national attention. But because she happened to be a practicing Muslim woman, she was, very conservative. She wore niqab herself. It was okay for her to be deemed a threat. I think in terms of what the impetus is for surveillance and for political surveillance, it's to sow mistrust and fear. If you don't know who around you can potentially trust, your circle continues to become smaller. And there's almost a degree of, I think, thought police. There's a bit of thought policing that starts to happen. If I don't know of the 5 people closest to me, if one of them's an informant, what can I say? What can I think? Can I think anti-American thoughts? Can I think that something is an injustice? But at its core, I think it really disintegrates the fabric of a community. one of the things that, you know, when you're young, again, like we, as young folks, were around a lot of folks who were converts, and we really wanted to be open and welcoming. A principal tenet of faith is to take people at their word, is to meet them where they are. And so what happens to people when you don't know if you can, there's a degree of trust, there's some gaslighting that happens. I think if I look back to the young woman I was around when I started college, who had started to warn me something's going on and to be careful, most of them honestly have disappeared entirely from public view. They're not on social media. A lot of them have moved away, and there isn't even really a way to find them. So the trauma that inflicts, the lack of safety in your own spaces, in your own home. When Aisha Irfan, a handful of us went to speak to some lawyers, one of the women was just like, you know, I've allowed this informant into my home. I don't know if she's planted something. I don't know if my place is bugged. I don't know if my bedroom is safe. And it really disintegrates just the relationships you have with the people around you, who you think you can trust, what you think you're allowed to do. And the solution that I found in my circles for a few folks was to just disappear and start over, in a sense.
Thank you, Aisha. Chip, your thoughts on additions for what is a political purpose and effects of the surveillance? I think you're on mute.
I am saying I am on mute while I'm muted. Yes, that is very helpful for me to do. I think a huge part of it is to chill speech, right? Part of it is about gathered information clandestinely, but some of it is they want you to feel watched because they want you to give up your voice and to be silent. And I think the biggest way we can resist is by never doing that, to continue to speak out.
Thank you. So I want to share a little bit of sort of, you know, I as Drum, we work with working class South Asian and Indo-Caribbean folks. We're trying to bring people into political activism, and we're educating them on surveillance, and then we're asking them to be politically active. And the question that oftentimes we get is, wait, you're asking us to do the same activity which gets us targeted. And I think for us, I'll talk a little bit about like sort of strategies in a bit, but in terms of like understanding the political purpose of it, and particularly for Muslim communities, this surveillance is happening in the context of wars and foreign intervention in Muslim communities. And particularly in the early years after 9/11, kind of as like the Afghanistan war was being justified, as the Iraq war case was being made, as the Iraq war was being justified, as the other interventions were being justified, these cases oftentimes come out at critical moments where those conversations are at their peak. And you know, I think if somebody were to do the research of like when cases were exposed in relation to like sort of what the public conversation was around either war or around budgets of military and law enforcement agencies, like those three factors, you'll find some level of like correlation. And so like they end up justifying the imperial wars that this country wages overboard because they say, look at these people, look at the danger they pose, this is why we are over there. The second, which I think both Aisha and Chip said, is in that it stifles dissent in the case of Muslim communities at very much the same time that the countries, our Muslim countries are being targeted. In the case of like Black liberation movements, both under COINTELPRO and now, it is very much at the same time that those movements are rising up and demanding change. And so it seeks to stifle that dissent. The third one, and we see this most clearly, I think, in the Muslim community, is once you stifle the dissent, it's not just that people stay quiet, but then people actually very openly and publicly pledge loyalty to the country, to the political project of the US, as a way to think that like this will protect us. And so we see, you know, like Muslim communities or organizations with like big flags, or justifying the wars more than even like sort of what the government itself will be doing. And so, you know, we have Muslim speakers at like national conventions talking about their children being soldiers and losing their lives there for this important cause. A fourth one is it justifies the funding for law enforcement agencies, for the FBI and the NYPD in particular. There's very clear moments of like kind of when you see the cases happen and how that is at very much moments where those agencies were trying to justify these programs and are able to use them to argue for an increase in funding. Aisha very well talked about sort of the undermining of social bonds and fabric. And then all in all, what it ends up doing is it reinforces the underlying injustices that underlie this country. So it justifies and reinforces settler colonialism. We see it sort of like in the targeting of indigenous communities and indigenous activism. Again, in COINTELPRO of the American Indian movement, currently around the fights against pipelines and for environmental activism. It reinforces white supremacy, it reinforces imperialism. And the last one, which I want to sort of push a little bit on, is it also reinforces capitalism. If you look at the series of activities for the targeting of Muslim communities of sort of like what is suspicious activity. So being religious is suspicious, being social is suspicious, being political is suspicious. So the only thing that's not suspicious is if you just go out and shop and like buy stuff, like that's fine. But pretty much anything else beyond that, you're too much into your studies, and if those studies happen to be something political, that's suspicious. You're too quiet and you don't engage with people, that's suspicious. So almost every part of our lives becomes deemed suspicious, aside from if we conform to this very narrow thing of buy and eat and go to sleep. And all of that then that kind of reinforces the whole cycle as a whole. Chip, you already sort of started on sort of how do we counter, how do we resist. Aisha, is there anything that you would like to add, both that you found personally useful and have seen play out in communities?
Yeah, I think there are multiple levers for change between organizing and legislative work and advocacy work. I think one thing and for me personally, like this work was my foray into public policy, and now like I professionally do this. And one thing that I found is there's nowhere we shouldn't be, but the movements really set the stage for everything else in terms of what's possible. If the movement's asks are really big and really holding folks accountable, it allows people in legislative office or staffers or in advocacy roles to take up the mantle. And I think when I started this work, I started as an organizer. It was very easy to look at elected officials and think this is where that is where all of the power lies. That is where we have to get into those doors. And I think, we saw this through the uprisings from George Floyd's murder over the last few weeks. Organizers and folks on the ground got more done in terms of getting cops arrested and policing budgets, at least, on the face getting cut, but those were more effective than years and years and years of us pursuing all of the other levers of change. So high level, I think the most powerful tool we have at our disposal is the movement, is to make sure we're loud and we're angry and we're not stopping. And that continues to enable other people to take better action. And the legislative routes and, these seats of power are really powerful, are really helpful. It's helpful to have someone on the inside. But at the end of the day, I think we should be taking all of our direction from movements and directly impacted folks on the ground.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Aisha. I think in Muslim communities and in activist communities, one of the things that we see is sort of when these cases happen, the response is to just sort of like retract and go into a shell as a way of like keeping ourselves safe. And at the same time, if we look at it historically in Muslim communities, if you actually think about like sort of what communities the informants will actually be able to be successful, I think with the exception of a couple of cases, it is actually very much in communities where the political conversations were reduced. Because if you can't have open political conversation, what it does is it drives political conversations underground. And so they're happening in like dark basements, they're happening in the corner of the masjid where like nobody else can hear you. And that's really where like a lot of the informants and the undercovers are actually able to engage in manipulative activity because there aren't enough people around to be able to like sort of ground people, check people, identify suspicious behavior. And so far, I think in our experience, and I think a lesson learned from like a lot of our elders who experienced COINTELPRO and then trained us on security is that open, collectivized, but disciplined political discussion and activism is like it's almost like antiseptic. Like it's like like sunshine. Like it reduces the possibilities of these agencies and these efforts to try to weasel in and try to do destructive activity because they're forced to. They can't do a lot of that stuff under those circumstances. And then obviously, I think as Aisha mentioned, we also understand like sort of that doesn't mean that there are limits to just sort of like very kind of procedural, like okay, like we'll meet with this legislator, or like we'll write this article. Sometimes you do have to push the bounds of what may be legal, and again, like sort of what is legal isn't necessarily what's just, but the grounding that process in a collective effort helps us think through what are the risks we're willing to take, what are the bounds that we're willing to push, what are the consequences and the blowback that we're willing to accept. My next question is, what are the opportunities for solidarity, for alliances, or for moving forward that you see in this moment? Maybe Aisha, if you want to go first.
Sure. So just, I think the organizing against surveillance for me really was the start of my political education in a lot of ways. And as I started looking into the NYPD's abuse of power, that's actually how I found out about stop and frisk. And for me, it was a really humbling and grounding moment. I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in Brooklyn. I wear that hat really, really proudly. But what bubble was I living in where I had no idea of just the gross overreach and violent nature of what the NYPD was doing across the city for decades, that had been built into the institutional way in which they operated. And so for me, and like a lot of folks around the 2010, 2011, as the movement for against stop and frisk was building up, it coincided with this movement of organizing against surveillance. And it's led to a complete reorientation of my life and my politics, and really, really looking to find those opportunities where our enemies and our struggles are the same, our oppressors are the same, folks who are trying to stifle our movements are the same. And so how do we really intentionally and thoughtfully work with other folks to make sure that there's no one left behind and that we're not throwing other communities under the bus when we, like the oppressors are the ones we need to be organizing against. And so I think there's a real opportunity that I've seen surface, that continues to be surfaced. I think, again, like watching the George Floyd uprisings play out a decade into my, after my start in organizing, I do think we're at a tipping point where I see the conversation shifting a little bit, where folks are realizing that it's going to take all of us, but it's also really important to make sure no one gets left behind.
Go ahead, Chip.
Yeah, I think that's a really great story and a really great point. I was involved somewhat in Occupy Wall Street back in 2011. And I remember how a lot of people who had experienced or seen how the NYPD engaged in police brutality against Occupy then got very concerned with police brutality issues, especially around stop and frisk, which, was predominantly visited upon communities of color. So I think it is true that people's experience with surveillance or police repression can sort of open their eyes to sort of the broader systemic nature of it. And I guess that gets us to the larger point is, why does this surveillance exist? And I think it's really important to remember that political surveillance is political, right? It's not neutral and random by the way they choose groups to target and to go after. So they're interested in going after racial justice groups. They're interested in going after groups that challenge U.S. foreign policy. They're interested in groups that challenge labor conditions in this country. I mean, the earliest political intelligence units in police departments were largely going after, you know, labor unions. The earliest forms of surveillance in this country are related to chattel slavery and racial chattel slavery. So there's a longer history where it seems pretty clear that, you know, surveillance is connected to, Alex Vitale, who talks about police abolition, always mentions that policing is about sort of managing or supporting regimes of exploitation and accumulation. And I think political surveillance is also about that. So by understanding what's being targeted and why, we can sort of build sort of a larger sense of solidarity amongst those movements when we realize they're part of sort of one broader struggle. That's my answer.
Thank you. Managing childcare while moderating. Thank you so much. I think I completely agree with what both Aisha and Chip have said. I think to be able to understand something, I don't know if any of you have ever seen like this image, and it's a saying from the subcontinent of 5 blind men are led someplace and they're asked to touch something. One of them touches it and says it's a tree trunk. Another one says, oh, I think it's a bat. Another one says it's a snake. I forget what the other one says, like it's, I don't know, like something sharp. And then kind of like the picture zooms out and it's actually an elephant, but like if you're touching just like one piece of it, like you don't really understand kind of what the whole thing is. And for us to be able to understand, what are the systems that we're operating in, that we're living under, what are the systems within that are used to target us and brutalize us here in the US or across the world, we have to be able to link together not only our experiences, but also like the history of what's happening, and then like the experiences of like other communities, and then like sort of like try to synthesize all of those things to be able to understand like what is the larger picture that exists. And we do have to understand that like the tactics that are used against our communities or developed on our communities will be used against other communities, and they'll come back. And that's not only just limited to within cities and countries here, but also globally, right? Like the Patriot Act was like copied almost word for word and instituted in dozens of countries across the world and is used as a part of their political repression. These same tactics that we've talked about around surveillance, like they've been copied by other countries, again, because the US is the leader, and so it sets the tone for many other countries. They have been copied, and in some cases, even law enforcement agencies from here have actually gone over and supported the development of these practices, these infrastructures, whether it's direct policing, street policing, or surveillance. And the same thing with the military. A lot of surveillance tactics, a lot of the police brutality tactics, a lot of them are techniques that developed through the military's experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then they're brought back home. So there's these dynamic relationships where things are, for them, like everything is interconnected. And so for us as communities and as movements, we can't afford to just be isolated and think of ourselves or only think of our experiences. We too also have to be interconnected to other communities, to other movements, to other experience, to other histories. I want to just move to questions as we're getting close to closing out. I think we only have one question so far, which is, how does all this surveillance tie into DHS security grants for houses of worship? I have a thought on that. I don't know if any of you have.
I'll let you start, and then I might jump in.
So, like those DHS or those types of grants have existed historically. Primarily, they used to go to Jewish synagogues and to like some extent, like some churches. In the maybe about like 12 years ago, I would say, is kind of we started to see DHS really start to push them for Muslim communities, and then to some extent for Hindu and Sikh communities. at this point, I don't think we've seen any sort of direct evidence, but given all the other patterns of DHS, I don't think that there is any other conclusion that could be drawn that that this will not be used as part of the surveillance. I think sort of from an understanding or a little bit knowledge we have of the technical setup, the DHS, they say, we just give you the money, you set up the system, but I think they recommend the vendors, and then I do think that they retain either direct access to that technology, or they retain a right to be able to access that technology whenever they want to, since they paid for it. And for these reasons, we've been engaged in conversations around not taking on those grants, because it further puts our community members at risk within Muslim communities, but also to talk about sort of security systems that we have histories of, particularly from African American Muslim communities here. There's lots of robust examples from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But even some of our own communities back home, particularly where there were religious minorities, have systems of how do we keep ourselves safe without further perpetrating surveillance or policing, whether it's the systemic policing official or just our own forms of just kind of policing people and surveilling people. Aisha, anything that you'd want to add?
Yeah, I think that was perfect. And how do I think it further perpetuates this narrative of the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim, the one that's going to work with law enforcement versus the ones that aren't. And what we found is individual actions can't undo what is intentionally created as systemic and institutional harm. And so it's really hard not to assume that all of these grants are at the end of the day perpetuating the surveillance apparatus.
Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. Sort of as a close, I'd like to offer people if there's a last closing comment and a call to action that you'd like to make. I'll start with Chip and then Aisha.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to recognize that political surveillance is not an exception in this society. It's the norm. Every major social movement has been subjected to political surveillance. We've seen that in the last 10 years alone. Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Abolish ICE, pro-Palestinian protesters, all have been subjected to political surveillance. We should be demanding that Congress do something to actually exercise oversight over the FBI and pass some meaningful reforms, but I'm not certain that's likely to happen. So I would say the call to action is to stay in the streets, stay raising your voice, stay speaking out for justice. Do not let them scare you into silence.
Aisha?
Thanks. Yeah. I think one thing I'd encourage everyone to remember that this is not a Donald Trump problem. This is not a Michael Bloomberg problem. We have seen surveillance in the most democratic of administrations, in the most left-leaning conversations. And it's because of that tension that had surfaced earlier of what do we think is legal and what do we think is allowed and what opinions are folks allowed to actually have. So I think knowing that, these systems are long-standing, they will continue, and we are not immune just because one person in power has changed, and so we have to continue to do our part to make it completely unacceptable as movements.
Thank you so much. I think a couple of things that I would want to end with, affirming everything that both Aisha and Chip have said. Again, that there's a long history of these struggles, and while we do need to fight to be able to reform a lot of these practices, a lot of these institutions, we at the same time, while doing that, we can also understand that some of these things are beyond reform, and that we really do have to fight towards a transformation of society, and some of that includes us re-envisioning what that new society would look like. And to be able to do that, I think the two calls to action that I would say is, particularly a lot of families and a lot of communities that have been targeted by these policies experience a lot of isolation. And so reaching out to building relationships with those people, with those families, with those communities, to be able to be stand in struggles alongside them is important. There's tons of families who struggle to be able to visit their loved ones when they're incarcerated. Sometimes they're very far away, and so like there's various ways that that we can get that sort of support. Second thing is that we really do have to question sort of what are the underlying ideas that we are perpetrating, either in our activism, in our demands. Do they just further assimilate into this existing kind of history that we talked about is so unjust, or does it seek to take us out of it? And again, I think we really do have to envision a different world. And lastly, to be able to do that, we do have to get organized. And I strongly believe that being organized means being a part of a collective. If it's not a formal organization, at least a collective of people. We can't do any of these things alone. Our power, we don't have the money, we don't have control of the media, but the things that we do have is our numbers and being able to leverage our power in the streets and through our voices. And so in the words of Stokely Carmichael, organize, organize, organize. I want to thank you all for joining us today, the panelists, Aisha and Chip, and to all the audience members. Have a good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum.